So last week, we went over the first church age, the apostolic age, and how it lined up with the letter of Ephesus. This week, we're going to be looking at the second and the third letters, how they line up. It shouldn't take us anywhere near as long as our exploration of the letters themselves. The rest will fall into place once we get through this part. First, we want to reread the letter. So Revelation 2, 8 through 11, we'll look at Smyrna. And to the angel of the church of Smyrna write, the first and the last, who was dead and has come to life, says this, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich. And the blasphemy by those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, so that you will be tested, and you will have tribulation for 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will come and give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death. So in this letter, we see people who claim to be Jews, but are not. And he means that they are not his people. When Jehovah first establishes the nation of Israel, he made them to be his people. By this, he meant those who follow him. They were set apart on earth. They were witnesses for him. They lived completely separately and different from everyone else around them so that they stood out from the rest of the people. They were obviously God's people. We see in 2 Samuel 12:24, for you have established for yourself your people Israel as your own people forever, and you, O Lord, have become their God. We see this in Jeremiah 31:1. At that time declares the Lord, I will be the God of all the families of Israel, and they shall be my people. Psalms 135:4. For the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel as his own possession. God chose them. He honors his promises. He purchased them out of Egypt. He saved them from their enemies, earned them their freedom. Right? They owe him for this. He used it as a claim over them many, many times, over and over again still today. Deuteronomy 7:6-8 is a good example. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his possession out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you nor choose you because you were more in number than any of these people, for you were the fewest of all peoples. But because the Lord loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your forefathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And you see this over and over again. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. He uses this claim over and over and over again. I don't have time to go through all of those verses because there's a lot of them. But he says, you are my people, you'll follow my law. In fact, even before he gave them the law, as soon as they crossed the Red Sea, he said, you are my people because you follow my law. Which is interesting since he, in the story, hadn't given it to him yet. With Abraham, God made an unconditional covenant that the Messiah was going to come through his line, that his people would multiply and be all over the earth. And he gave Abraham the land. And he said, this is yours. There's nothing they could have done to mess this up. Because, like all of us, if they were given the chance, would have messed it up a million times over. God did this one for himself. When he made this covenant with Abraham, if you remember, he knocks Abraham out. He had him set up the animals, cut them in half, put a half on each side, and they were going to walk together to the altar and cut this covenant. And it was saying that we make this covenant together. If either of us breaks it, let it be done to us what's been done to these animals, was the idea. But God knocks Abraham out, shows up, and he walks through. Abraham did not enter this covenant. God made it to Abraham. He pledged by himself to himself that he would honor his own covenant. The status of his protection over Israel, however, is dependent on several conditional covenants that were made after this. If they obey, he protects. When they worship other gods, for instance, he removes this protection. We see this when they get corrected and judged. It happens with the Philistines, happens with the Assyrians, happens with the Babylonians. Each time they violated a conditional one, whatever that condition was, whatever that punishment led to is what they got. So the Abrahamic covenant is unconditional. The one that makes them the Messiah's people, the ones that he comes through, the ones who have that land that he chose out of the entire world. All of the universe is God's creation. All of it's his. But he picks this segment of land, much larger than what they have today, and he says, that's mine, specifically. And then he gives it to Abraham and his people. Now, once Jesus does arrive, and he's rejected, and he dies for the world, the church is born. And when the church is born, it alters this category. Then, the people who are his, Abraham's descendants, suddenly take on new members. In Galatians 3:29, Paul says, and if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise. Now, are we all genetically related to Abraham? No. I mean, all right, if you go back far enough, many of us might be. But if that were the reason, then it wouldn't denote belonging to Christ as the requirement of being one of the descendants. You'd already be one of the descendants, so you wouldn't have to belong to Christ to be part of this group. This becomes a category to God. His people are also called the descendants of Abraham as spiritual successors to the promise. It is now a supernatural category that people fall into. This category is made up of the people who follow him, not just people. This is not to say that God's done with Israel. The program just went differently than we expected it to, especially than they expected it to. And looking back, hindsight's 2020, you can see how this was the plan the whole time. Now his people, Jesus tells us in John 10:27, that his own hear his voice and they know him. This has nothing to do with genetics, but everything to do with those who hear him and follow him, because they're his people. It involves the Gentiles. So you could be a Jew genetically and not fall into his people now. Or you could be a Gentile and fall into the category of his people, because it's a new category. So these Jews claimed this, but they weren't his, he says, because they weren't following him. They were against him and his work and his saved. They actively persecuted the Christians. We see this actually in the Bible over and over again. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:32 that there are only three categories of people: Jews, Gentiles, and the church. Before salvation, you are either Jew or Gentile. Jew gets a special mention because they're Israelites. Everybody else gets lumped into one, Gentiles. No matter which one you start in, when you're saved, you come out of it and you're part of the third category, which is the church. That Jew-Gentile division still exists. There's just now another part. And there's a legalism that gets implanted into the church age that the apostles end up refuting after a visit from Paul. There's an entire meeting in Acts 15, and there's a debate because they're demanding that Gentiles who get saved need to be circumcised first, proselytized to Judaism, then get saved. They should have to go through everything the Jews had to go through first. And Peter actually speaks up and ends this very eloquently, stating, if only we could accept it as easily as the Gentiles do. Yet, Peter gets rebuked by Paul in Galatians 2 for his difference of behavior between the Jews and the Gentiles. Peter agrees with Paul with the legalism issue in 2 Peter 3:14-16, saying that salvation is indeed mysterious, but God did it with the Gentiles nonetheless. It's hard for us as Jews to understand how this works, he says, but it's what it is. It's up to God. This is very much changed in the Jewish mind. Jesus came and upended their entire view of the Messiah. Threw it all out of whack. They were not expecting him to come the way he comes and do what he did and then die. That's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to come and get rid of the Romans. They already had in their mind exactly that he was going to come in their time and fix their problem there in the way they wanted it. We do that a lot, don't we? We have a problem. We plead with God. It has to be this way, or this way. We want this solution. And when we don't get our solution, sometimes, let's be honest, we get mad. We don't like that we don't get our solution. God, I need a car. I want a Ferrari, for instance. You gave me a minivan. I mean, granted, it's a car. It's what I asked for. But you knew what I wanted. A minivan, right? So, through Acts, we see that the Jewish people are the cause of the problems for the Christians. Luke points this out. In Antioch, they caused the problem, Acts 13:50. In Iconium, Acts 14:2 and 5. In Lystra, in Acts 14:19. And in Thessalonica, in Acts 17:5. Due to these actions, the early church ended up becoming anti-Semitic, unfortunately, because they were always being persecuted by it. But there were a lot of people who just claimed to be Christian who just felt this way too, so that didn't help much. When we remove the Old Testament, for instance, we can arrive there. We can arrive very quickly at anti-Semitic behavior because we remove them from the picture. Paul spends 3 chapters in Romans spelling out how God is not done with Israel. The world's timeline is actually Israel's timeline. We see it in Daniel 9. So here in Smyrna, though, we're seeing the same source of trouble by those who truly believe the law of Moses was still the way to go, and Jesus is not the Messiah, so they're persecuting the church. And Jesus said they would come back, and they will bow at your feet and apologize. And they do. We have this historically, where the entire Jewish quarter ends up saved and joining the church there. This is also where we talked about the bishop of Smyrna, Polycarp. In 166 AD, he was told to recant his faith. And he answered, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me wrong. How can I now blaspheme my king who has loved me so? The Jews of the city burned him alive at the stake on the Sabbath day. Now, I might be wrong, but I think dragging someone around, tying them to a stake, and lighting a fire would count as work. So the law conveniently doesn't mean anything when they don't want it to. The church saw a lot of tares sown into the wheat. This is something Jesus saw a lot. And they weren't just people. They had to deal with the tares of legalism, which is the denial of Jesus' completed work on that cross. They had to deal with pre-Gnosticism, which denies the humanity or true existence of Jesus, and some other odd ideas that Paul has to counter. And they had to deal with Caesar worship, which is meant to deny Jesus as the Most High. Because remember, Caesar was placed above all the gods and your ultimate loyalty test. The devil was really working overtime on them. On top of this, we see in verse 10, they should expect prison and persecution. The tribulation they would suffer would last 10 days. You take this how you want. Time periods can be used to represent a lot of things in Hebrew coding. But if you look at the emperors who persecuted the church, we see they had a lot of emperors, but not all of them persecuted the church. Nero, Domitian, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, Septimus Severus, Maximinus, Decius, Valerian, Aurelian, and the worst of them all, Diocletian. That's a total of 10, for a total of 250 years of persecution. When diseases fell on Rome, because they brought them back from their expansionist wars, they blamed it on the Christians. When the Tiber overflows and it destroys the grain storehouses and causes a famine, they blame it on the Christians. They were the new group in town. They didn't believe and worship the gods they worshipped. Logically, you can follow it. Christianity became a crime. It continued to spread, though. Making it a crime didn't stop it. Oddly, more than 5 million Christians are said to have died during this window. 5 million Christians. Many more are still persecuted and killed today. They don't get quite the same mention. But many don't want to hear about today's persecution. They want to blame us. It's our own fault when we're outlawed in the country, or we're hunted down and tortured, killed for our faith. We see in this letter that we're promised that. We're promised persecution. We will have trials. Do not confuse this with the Great Tribulation. This happens. They are not the same thing. This simply states a promise that our faith will make us targets. That's reality. You've all experienced it some way or another, whether you even know it or not. People just don't like you for some reason. Usually it's supernatural. It's not them, necessarily. It's a supernatural root in their lives that conflicts with the Holy Spirit in yours. So by default, you butt heads. You don't like each other. Jesus understood this. This is why he could hang on the cross and say, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. But if you look at the text, well, they knew what they were doing. They're held accountable, so clearly they knew what they were doing. But Jesus has seen something different. He's seen the spiritual influence on these people. He's seen the demonic activity in their hearts and seen the real source of this hate is that they want the Messiah stopped. The people wanted their Messiah, but the demons don't. This is the same kind of love we're expected to have. We see past those things. They could have every logical reason in the world to hate us, but we see past it. We see that there's a supernatural influence there, and it's not them. They are not irredeemable. They deserve the Lord as much as we do. They need the Lord as much as we do. We know that. And through the Holy Spirit, we are able to look past that and into the heart of the person and see the hurting person behind those actions, behind those words. This is why we can forgive when nobody else can. It tells us in verse 11 that we were born once but died twice. It says you will not taste the second death. You're born once, but people die twice unless they're saved, and then they're born twice and die once. In 2 Timothy 3:12, Paul admonishes Timothy saying, indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Do they all go through the Great Tribulation? No, most of these people are long dead. But this is the logic people use. They flip the two to kind of discount the rapture, discount the idea of the tribulation. You have to be careful when you extend statements out to include the future events. This happens a lot in the Bible. A lot. Many people's favorite verses are local, ancient, focused promises or statements that are aimed solely at the audience in view, and we like to take them and run with them. Not that they don't apply, but there was a very local mention at that point. Smyrna, as we can see, represents the age of the persecuted church. This is what they went through. After the apostolic age, it started to spread, and they were persecuted very heavily. Then, the letter to Pergamos, Revelation 2:12-17. And to the angel of the church of Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and you hold fast my name, and did not deny my faith even in the days of Antipas my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you, because you have there some who hold the teaching of Balaam, who kept teaching Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and commit acts of immorality. So you also have some in the same way who hold the teaching as the Nicolaitans. Therefore repent, or else I am coming to you quickly, and I will make war against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says. To him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and give him a white stone and a new name written on it, which no one knows but he who receives it. Now, when we looked at this letter, we talked about Asclepius, the caduceus, medical symbol, if you will, the winged staff. Let me give you a little more history. So in Babylon, pagan religion was reborn after the flood. It really hit a pinnacle when the Lord decided, I gotta wipe it all out. It hit a level that it never hits. It's interesting because as bad as we talk about things being, it's not at that level. When we truly understand what was going on then, we're not at that level. At the level where God has to pour out wrath. This happens again in Revelation because it gets that bad. But not yet. As bad as it is, it's going to get a lot worse. The idea of worshiping false gods really gets going. The fallen may have been dealt with, but their legacy was still very strong in these people's minds. And they sought to regain that. Babylon was a hotbed for this. And together with its sister city, Acadia, which is just north, and it was formed, really short after that. It was the source for all these gods and myths that we see later. It all started back then. So when Cyrus conquers Babylon, the Babylonian priesthood flees. And they set up a new place for themselves in Pergamus, where this letter is for. And as the center of power continues to shift over the centuries, the religion takes on more Greco-Roman titles and becomes the foundation for Rome. The king of Pergamus took on a unique title, Pontifex Maximus. You may have heard this title before. The high priest of the pagan system in Latin. In Rome, each Caesar was appointed as the new pontifex by default, the head of the pagan system. This continues until 378 AD when Damascus, the bishop of Rome, finished absorbing the system and mixes it with Christianity. Rome was founded in 753 BC. It subdues Italy in 343 to 272 BC, in that range of war. It conquers Carthage from 264 to 146 BC, then Greece, then Asia Minor. From 133 to 31 BC, it adds Spain, Gaul, Britain, and the Teutons. And by 63 BC, it has taken over Judea. It's in its zenith. It's an empire that spanned from the Atlantic to Euphrates, from the North Sea to the African desert, and has a population of 120 million. It sounds like a lot until you realize how big America is, but this is a lot of territory for any empire, and it was the biggest at the time. Augustus inaugurated this thing called emperor worship. Its idea was to bond the people with a common sentiment. They all agreed, this is the guy. Pergamus becomes the center for this. And the first temple to Caesar was put there in 27 BC. So from Vespasian on, it becomes a test of loyalty. Well before Jesus is born, this is a test of loyalty to all people. Who do you claim as your most high? And you have to burn incense on the altar. This is well established in the culture because it's enforced by law. So from here on, the empire shifts quite a bit. Now, rulers change, so do the rules. In fact, you'll find that the average lifespan of a rule of an emperor was very short. But for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them all. I got 4 pages of dates. But you see Julius Caesar back then, and then you go to Augustus, Christ was born, Tiberius, Caligula. who tried to desecrate the temple and failed. Claudius Nero. You got 3 guys between 68 and 69 AD. Next one. Vespasian, Titus. There's Domitian. He's the one that banished John. Trajan, Hadrian, Antiochus Pius. That's the Bar Kokhba revolt. Marcus Aurelius. He was the worst since Nero. That was during the peak of Rome's empire. It was its strongest. Next. Commodus, Barak, the Barak emperors who were all appointed by the army. It creates a civil war during this whole period. Septimus Severus, Caracalla, Elagabalus, yes. Alexander Severus. See, they tolerated Christianity, favored Christians, actually. Maximus was whatever. He didn't really care. Next. Phillips really liked Christians. Decius persecuted them. Valerian killed Origen. Gallienus favored us again. Aurelian. And Diocletian. He was the worst. Systematically tried to erase Christianity one by one. So, through this, there's a lot of people that just didn't care, and there's a lot of people who liked us. But there were 10 specifically that hated us, just like the last letter said. And we get to Constantine after this. And Constantine's famous, the emperor, right? Because Constantine makes Christianity the state religion, or so we're told. He doesn't, actually. In 312 AD, Constantine was on a mission to take out his rival, Maxentius, and have full control of the empire. He knew that his father had actually prospered by praying to the Christian God. So he figures, I'll try that. So he prays, and the next day, as the story goes, he sees a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, in hoc signo vinces, meaning, in this sign thou shalt conquer. Constantine defeats Maxentius at the Milan Bridge, and Constantine immediately declares that from that day on, he's a Christian now. Because he prayed and got what he wanted. So, in 325 AD, he signs the Edict of Toleration, which allowed freedom for all religions. All religions. But Christianity was especially favored. Christians had the favor of the court. It's the first time Christian ministers were exempted from taxes. And Constantine recommended all people should try it. He didn't enforce anything. He just said, this is what I am. Here's freedom for everybody. I really think you guys should try this. In 330, he moves the capital to Byzantium, renames it Constantinople. We know it as Istanbul, not Constantinople. I just want to be clear. If you have a date in Constantinople, she'll be waiting in Istanbul, right? Remember. So, Constantine ended the gladiators, that whole gladiatorial arena. He ends that. He reduces killing of children. He abolishes crucifixion. He repeals the persecution edicts that were put in by Diocletian. He declared himself head of the church. It's always kind of a warning sign, isn't it? Some guy's like, I'm head of it all. It's like, wait a minute. He promoted Christians to high offices. He declares Sunday a day of worship and forbids work on it. You should tell your bosses. Ever since I don't have to work on Sunday, look up Constantine. He said so. And he's emperor. I don't know, you're not emperor, you're just my boss. And he reduces slavery. Slavery was a huge part of Rome. In fact, half of everyone called citizens in the city were not citizens. They were literally half of the population were slaves. They were slowly merging Christianity into the world. And Christians loved it. Don't we? Let's be honest, we do. When we're popular, it's great. Everybody who once hated us liked us. We got out of taxes. We got our days recognized. People know all about us. Work's real easy for us. America used to be like that. During 361 to 363 AD, though, Constantine's gone, and a guy named Juan the Apostate sought to bring back paganism as the main religion. He starts bringing it back, reinstating all of it, getting rid of the Christian stuff. Didn't last, though, because that was his reign. 61, 62, 63. About 3 years is pretty average for these guys. Some don't even get that. Then from 363 to 364, 1 year, Jovian reestablished Christianity in the empire. Then 368 to 395, 48 years after Constantine, Theodosius makes Christianity the enforced state religion. This could sound good, but what it actually does is it forces the unrepentant to claim Christianity and join the church. But they're not part of the church. They're just in the pews. They're still pagan, but they have to play the game. They have to create secret societies and go underground because they're in the church by day, but at night, they're doing what they always did. Apostates became plentiful because nobody wanted to do it. They try it and walk away because they like their way better, They sought power, just like we were warned would happen. Heathenism emerged in the world church, and things during this window change a lot. Pagan temples are just rebranded as Christian churches. Pagan priests are now Christian priests. I mean, could you imagine if that happened today? Just imagine, some imam, Muslim imam, is suddenly now Christian. Only in title. He didn't actually get saved. Or some Satanist priest is now Christian. In name only. He wears the title. He has the authority in the human system inside your church. But he doesn't believe a lick of it. This is what happened. Because it was enforced. They had no choice. So it seems like a big win on paper, but it's not. Historically, after persecution, Christianity grows. Christianity didn't shrink and die. In spite of that being the very point of the persecution, it increases. The church cannot be taken down. And people will challenge that idea, but it can't. Jesus said so. The gates of hell shall not prevail against this. And no matter what the world thinks of itself, it's not at that level. And the gates of hell can't do it. Attacks from outside will only serve one purpose, and that is to spread our message. That's how it works. What's interesting is that when people see us persecuted and suffering, do you know what they see? When we hold our faith, that we mean it. It's one of the greatest witnesses we have, because when we go through trouble and the Lord is glorified by us in spite of the trouble, we are unique because no one else does this. Other religions have done this where they've converted simply because they watch Christians killed for their faith, given the chance to recant, and they refuse. Even children. And they refuse because they know Jesus is real. Persecution only gets more people saved. God is not surprised that some hold and some fall during persecution. He always knew it. We don't always. Persecution teaches us some interesting things. Struggles teach us interesting things. It proves who we are. When something bad comes to you, when you get bad news, think of the last time you got bad news. Could have been yesterday, could have been this morning, could have been last week. Last time you had some really bad news, what was your first reaction? Don't tell me, but it proves who we are. How do we respond to the bad news? It's interesting because I'd prepped this days ago. And then last night at the graduation, he said something very similar. That it's all about how you respond. It's not about the good and the bad. Because you're going to have both. It's part of life. But it's how you respond to the good and the bad. It proves to the world who we are and who he is. Because it proves he must be God. He must be king. We must be serious about this. This must mean something to us. That we go through these diseases, or we go through these trials, or we go through all this stuff, and we don't bend. We only get stronger in our faith. So we're either mentally ill, or this is real. What about times of peace and prosperity, though? Well, what about a country when there's no persecution? And we're everybody's favorite? What about when we run things? Have you ever heard the phrase, because it's been echoed a lot recently, easy times make weak men? It's true. We don't fail usually as Christians in our hard times. We fail in our good times. Think about it. Attacks coming during the hard times, when we're on guard, when we're praying, when we're deep in our faith and our word because we have to be, those attacks don't get very far. But when everything's going good, and our guard's not up because everything's going good, that's when we fail. It was once said we always fail in our best suit. Tends to be true. We let our guard down. We aren't paying attention. We only notice attacks when they're in the radar. When they slip under the radar, because we're not paying attention, or we don't trust the radar, and we think, it's nothing to worry about, then the attacks work. So when the persecution had ended, we found ourselves as Christians at the top of the world. And the growth had just started, and we were all of a sudden the majority. And then we made mistakes. And we made compromises. And we took all these beliefs, and instead of towing a line, letting people have their choice, but towing a line, we said it's okay, everything can come in. Pergamus is the root word for pergamy. We talked about this. It means mixed marriage. We have monogamy, single marriage, polygamy, multiple marriages, which has become a social no-no. Technically, it breaks down into multiple wives or multiple husbands. We now have what's called ethical non-monogamy. Yes, this is a thing. You have to learn about it in therapy. It's called ethical non-monogamy. It's when you and your spouse have an agreement. And I'm supposed to say, if that's what works for you, hey. That's the official statement. I'll spell it for you. So as a marriage therapist, technically, if you come to me and you say, my spouse cheated, I can't say, that's bad. Can't say it. I have to say, well, we have to figure out if that works for you or not. Maybe ethical non-monogamy is a better way for your marriage to work. Except then it's not a marriage. See the problem there? But whatever. But that's like technically how I have to do it. So, believe me, I don't. But then we have pergamy. And pergamy is that mixed marriage. And by definition, it means objectionable. It's not what you want. It's two things that shouldn't be together. Socially abnormal. This letter is aimed at a time where this is happening. And this is the window of time that's next, where the world marries the church. And the church lets it. And the church decides, we can allow all this other stuff to come in. No big deal. What we got to lose? We're famous. We're supposed to be married to the Lord. So marrying the world is automatically wrong and automatically objectionable. So we see why Jesus hits them with a concern about compromise. Because it's what you're doing. This is the problem. In Ephesus, they had a distraction. They were well-meaning, but they got distracted and they lost sight of the most important thing. They were so focused on the work, they forgot why they did the work. Which, if it were any other job, would actually sound really cheesy. But why are we here? Not for paychecks. Yes, we are. Okay. But in the church, we can get away with this. So we do it for the Lord. And that's true, because that's the only thing we have. So they got sidetracked. The world wasn't their concern. They didn't let anything else in. They held that doctrine. but they just lost the reason that was behind it. And when you lose the reason behind it, you lose the heart of it. You lose the outreach because you don't really care. You lost the love. See? Like, yeah, I'll do all these mission trips, but honestly, I don't really care. You get saved or not. Like, I want you to, but it's more for my checklist or something. You start to lose sight of why you're doing it and why it matters. Then, Smyrna. Whereas they grew, in spite of this, they grew, and then they're attacked because now they're a big target. And they get attacked and attacked and attacked and attacked. And guess what happens? They get bigger. And because they're attacked, their guard's up. And Jesus has nothing bad to say about them because their guard's up. And persecution is hitting, but you're growing. Persecution's hitting, but your witness never fails. Persecution's hitting, but your heart's where it needs to be. But then we get to Pergamos. And after the persecution ends in the empire, guess what happens? Now we're famous. And now we're famous, we mix. Because the temptation of being famous is just too much. Having the best jobs, having the best everything. We like it. Jesus tells them he knows their focus on the doctrine of idols. They lord over the people, and they have idol worship in their lives. He tells them this. The next period is mixing with the world, where we begin to accept the ways of the world into our circles instead of removing it or keeping it out in the first place. We saw ourselves become liked by a world that had shunned us and despised us and jailed us and beaten us and tortured us and murdered us. And this appealed to us. Oh, why wouldn't it? I mean, think about it. Naturally, wouldn't it appeal to you? Where all of a sudden, you're in a country where it's illegal to be a Christian and you're persecuted and beaten and put in jail all the time. And then the government's toppled, a new leader comes in, Christianity's not illegal anymore. You get out of jail. You're not beaten anymore. Isn't that appealing? Of course it is. You're human. Right? So in closing, this is not the best thing. If we had towed the line, upheld the freedom of choice, honored God above all others, but kept the standards high, it'd be fine. But that's not what happened. The world does not want our standards high, ladies and gentlemen. The world doesn't. The world likes us when we're like them. The world likes Christians that have the same or worse hang-ups. If you want proof, you can just watch the media. Any show that has a Christian in it, and watch. They are as flawed or worse than the people around them. You can be that, but keep it hidden. Don't tell me about it. Unless you're going to tell me how you're just as bad as me. Unless you're as angry or as resentful or bitter or lustful, perverted as them, then it's okay. But if you're holding the line and holding a standard, now we got a problem. Because see, that means they have to live up to something. It's the same as us. We read the Bible and it offends us. Why? It's a standard we have to live up to. It's a standard reflected back at us, showing us in a mirror a standard we don't match. We don't like it. The word offends. It's supposed to offend. That's its point. Offense is actually a good thing. Toughens you up. That's why there was a boy named Sue. See? Song. You get offended, well, it's not always a bad thing. When we alter the way we do things, the world applauds. When we do nothing to offend them, we don't push them towards Jesus, we allow sin, we don't discuss salvation and hell, we try to make this more palatable to the world out there, they like us. But you know what happens then? We're not the church. We've removed everything that makes us the church. How can we be the church when we remove everything? How can we be what we're supposed to be or do the job we're supposed to do? Because the world is pressuring us and we let them pressure us into changing our opinion or shutting up about the truth of God's word. Many have said, America is the last great bastion of freedom in this world. I don't know if you've noticed, but in other countries, they don't show it here as much. But if you see posts from other countries, they're encouraging us to stand firm. They see what's going on right now. Probably better than most Americans do. And they encourage us to not fail because we're the last country that has the rights that we do. And they're trying to take them. They want you to think you've already lost them. You haven't. But the reality is we're the last ones to have it. We're the only country in the world that allows guns. Do you know that? Allows guns. Freely, only one. There's one other that does it with some strict limitations. We're the only one that has freedom like that. Freedom of speech? Yeah, that went out the window a long time ago in other countries. That's just not a thing everywhere else. You post the wrong thing in Britain, you get jail time. They do. They will imprison you for posting a joke they don't like or making a sarcastic comment to the wrong person online on Facebook. They will imprison you. That is a thing. Other countries don't get that. We have this freedom. They want to try to manipulate and lie and deceive us into thinking that we aren't what we are. But we are. But this is what the church is too. The church is the last bastion and the only bastion ever of freedom, of salvation. Freedom from sin. The only witness for him here. That's why we're here. That's why we're not gone. We're here to be a witness. We are meant to be the witness. We are the last and only witness here. So if we lose that, if this happens, if we don't hold the line, we have to stand firm against the conviction against sin. We have to stand firm and hold a line against corruption. We have to stop that slow fade. We have to correct the course. You know where it starts? Right here. Every one of us. It starts right here. If we don't hold that line of conviction in our own lives, then how can we do it anywhere else? And how can we ask anybody else to? Often misquoted, judge not, lest ye be judged, is because we are to judge with a righteous judgment. A few verses later, the judgment we use is what we're held against. So, we are to judge. But just remember that we can't be hypocritical. If we don't hold the standard here, we can't hold it to anybody else. If we let these things go, why would they believe it when we don't believe it? When we've compromised so much we don't live it, why would they live it? They have no reason to. So, this week, focus on the truth of God's word, the Spirit of God guiding us to have the integrity that we claim to have, to be the people of God that we claim to be. Let the Spirit guide you. God, what do I need to improve on? What do I need to get rid of? What do I need to fix? Where do I need to be stronger? Have I compromised your word in any way in my life? If you're really honest, you'd probably be surprised by the answer. If you need or like prayer, we're here to pray for you. If you need him, he's always here. Let's stand and sing.